You're going to talk about wrestling. That's redneck talk.
You know, it's my great pleasure right now to introduce to everybody a man who really needs no introduction.
Karl.
Dragon.
King.
I'm not calling the fans geeks. I'm not calling them rednecks, tobacco chewing nothing, because I've done all that myself.
Karl.
Dragon.
King. Karl.
In your dreams, you will see me.
Dragon. King.
Somebody say something. When we're bad, we're real bad. And when we're good, we're real good.
Dragon. King.
And this is for you, Fannie Mae. Solid gold, baby, just like you and me.
World's greatest wrestler. I'm the best you've ever seen.
Excuse me, please, let's don't talk negatively.
Hey everybody, Karl Stern here from Dragon King Karl Classic Wrestling Audio Show. I continue to try to provide you a little extra listening material during this time where many people are under stay-at-home orders and different things like that. And so on Thursdays every week, in addition to my regular shows on Tuesday, as long as Brian is willing and okay with it, I'm going to continue to upload some shows from my archives over at my website, whenitwascool.com. Over there, we do a show every single day for many of them free, many of them for our Patreons. And recently, I've begun doing a series called the Saga of, and so far I've done 3 of these, and they have gotten tremendous reviews. I mean, the best reviews I've ever gotten for any of the shows I've done. In fact, one of our Patreons said, Karl, I've been listening to you over at Wrestling Observer for a decade or so, listening to your shows over here. These are the best ones you've ever done, and I really appreciate that. So far I've done a show called The Saga of Hulk Hogan in the AWA World title. I've done one called The Saga of David Von Erich in the NWA World title. And the one you're going to hear today is the saga of Ric Flair jumping to the WWF while still holding the WCW and NWA World Championships. And what these are longer than average shows. They are historically everything you want to know. I go in and dig out the observers from that time period, other newsletters if I can find them that complement the story. I go on to my timeline at whenitwascool.com, the ultimate history of wrestling. I go and watch many, if not most, all of these matches, all these angles, and then I sit down and really just break down the minutia of everything. How did this happen, and what the historical perspective is on it. And a lot of times I find out, well, the historical perspective is the narrative that comes out. It's kind of not really as true as we might think it is. In this particular show you're going to hear, we talk not only about Ric Flair jumping to the WWF with the NWA and WCW World title, his falling out with Jim Herd and WCW, but you'll hear about all the just craziness and insanity going over are happening at WCW. And I tell you, I think the segment about the quicksand is going to make the best of at the end of the year. I have a feeling that's going to make the cut because it is ridiculous. And it's a story I don't hear told very much that apparently was true. And then we talk about the narrative of why Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair did not headline WrestleMania VIII. And I know many of you say, well, Dave said it's because those house shows drew terribly and so forth. And that's partially true, but that didn't have to be the case. And it's a lot more complicated than that. I still think it was a mistake, and I'll make my case for that and how they should have gone about doing it, plus how they actually did it. You'll hear all that on there. And then the David Von Erich show is in detail the last several months of his life, from basically Labor Day of 1983 until his death, and then what happens after his death, Was he really promised the NWA World title? If so, when was he going to hold it? I think we can narrow it down to when that was going to be. We take a look at Kerry Von Erich's reign as NWA World Champion in great detail. If you think, as many people do, that Kerry just won that title at the Parade of Champions, then went to Japan and dropped it back to Flair, I think you're going to be surprised. Kerry defended that belt a lot in those few days he held it. And not just in Texas, but in Florida and other places as well. You'll get that whole breakdown. So I hope you enjoyed this show. If you enjoy it, the other Saga portions are available at the $1 Patreon level at When It Was Cool. Most of my wrestling stuff, most of the shows wrestling related over there are at the $5 level, but I understand, man, times are weird right now, and so these Saga series, if you want the others, if you'll sign up at the $1 level, it takes about 2 minutes to sign up and cancel at any time. $1 gets you a month access to several hundred shows, and among them are all 3 of these Saga series. And I think I'm going to work on another one and do another one next week. I've got a couple topics in mind that I'm wanting to deep dive into. So there may be more of these. But until then, I hope you enjoy the saga of Ric Flair jumping to the WWF while still NWA and WCW World Champion. I think you're going to learn a lot and have a few laughs along the way.
Nowhere in the pages of history can one find a greater champion of justice. Return with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear.
And I'll tell you something else, too, is I cannot stand sissies.
You're going to talk about wrestling. That's redneck talk.
And guess what, fatso? I'm the world champion.
Hey everybody, Karl here with another bonus show for our Patreons. This is not part of any regular series or part of anything we're normally doing. Basically, this is just something extra for you to say thank you. We continue to hit our goal on Patreon. We continue to have, even in the midst of this pandemic crisis world we're living in, we continue to add new people. Slowly but surely, every single month so far, we've hit our goal. I'm hopeful we'll do that in April as well. These extra bonus shows have been very beneficial in doing that. Seems like people are searching for more content and things to listen to, and some stuff off the beaten path is wrestling right now is either non-existent or terrible for the most part. Some of you may have your favorite things, but New Japan's largely inactive. AEW, empty arena stuff is only going to be so good. WWE, less said about it, the better. So let's talk some history. And one of our Patreons, again, as a Patreon supporter, if you're hearing this podcast, the only people that can hear this are our Patreons. I'm not putting this up at Observer or anything else. This is just for you. A way of saying thank you. One of your powers you get, a superpower you develop when you become a Patreon supporter, is you could suggest topics. And I try to work those into shows where I can. Andrew, who's one of our very valued, longtime supporters, absolute blessing to our website, to Tanya and I. Andrew is great. And he has a thought experiment for us. And I'm going to take that thought experiment and with your permission, your blessing, Andrew, I'm going to actually extrapolate from it. We're going to do more than just that. I'm going to talk about a deep dive into history of this event, and we'll work in the elements of your experiment in with it, and amongst other questions we're answering. Andrew said, would Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair have drawn better in 1991-1992 if the WWF and the National Wrestling Alliance, the NWA, could have reached an agreement to continue to recognize Ric Flair as NWA champion after WCW stripped him of the title and he was called NWA champion on WWF TV? So there's a little bit to unpack right there. We got to travel back in time to 1991, and you may be saying to yourself, I thought the NWA and WCW were the same thing, and promotion-wise, they are. If you're watching the TV show, it's the same show that NWA was a year or so earlier it was NWA. It's just kind of morphed into WCW, which is basically, it's not exactly right, but to me, it's a good way to differentiate between like the Jim Crockett years and the Ted Turner years. As the 1990s go along into the early 90s, and we're talking about 1991 here, it morphs into WCW, and NWA is actually, in reality, an independent body. It still exists in the same way it existed way back into the 1940s and 1950s as an independent body of independent promoters. Now, at this point in time, nobody had any power. None of these independent promoters, I think Dennis Corluzzo was on that group, Steve Rickard, of all people, who hadn't been relevant in many years as a promoter, was still on there. I imagine Jim Herd or some other WCW executive was probably on there. The NWA existed largely on paper as an idea, but it had the brand, it had the name, it had the years of building up the National Wrestling Alliance, the world's oldest and largest sanctioning body in professional wrestling. We heard how many times Gordon Sully say that over the years. So the World Championship, that is the top belt at this time. Now, later, things change, things split, but let's don't get into that. We're talking about 1991 right here. The singular world heavyweight champion at this point in time is Ric Flair, and he has one belt, which is the big gold belt, the very famous, Crumb Rind belt that come along in 1986 that replaced the old domed globe. That belt, it even said Ric Flair on the nameplate. That belt was actually recognized by two different governing bodies. It was recognized as the World Championship of WCW, World Championship Wrestling, and of the NWA, the National Wrestling Alliance. To the average fan buying the average ticket, none of this mattered. He was the world champion. Okay? But in reality, that belt was recognized by two different people, and that becomes important here in a moment. So let's travel back in time. I don't actually have my physical wrestling observers pulled out for this for right now. They're in a box somewhere going back this far, and I'm not exactly sure. Trying to get everything swapped over to digital as I work on this Ultimate History Pro Wrestling project. 1991, I don't have, and I don't believe they're up at Observer. Let me look and see. Let me make sure that's not true first, because they may very well be. So WrestlingObserver.com, newsletter archive, and actually, Wrestling Observer newsletter. Actually, they may be. It says there are, in fact, yes, 1991, believe it or not, the year is there. How about that? So that makes this easier and better. We're going to go to July of 1991, and I've got a summary that's been put up on the internet of these issues, but then we'll look at that summary first, and then if we need to deep dive into the issue and dig up some more, we will. So we're talking about Jim Herd is the president of WCW at this point, and he has not a clue what he's doing. Ric Flair is the WCW/NWA World Heavyweight Champion, represented with one belt, the big gold belt, and he is in a creative contractual battle with WCW. Jim Herd has no value for Ric Flair. Okay, he thinks Ric Flair is old and needs to cut his hair and become Spartacus, and doesn't just, Jim Herd, basically, to sum up kind of Jim Herd, is Jim Herd was an executive at Turner who did have a background in wrestling. He was a minion to Sam Mushnick, of all people, but make no mistake, he wasn't a wrestling brainiac, okay? It's kind of the same as saying, you're a janitor at Walmart, and they come along and say, hey, tell me how they balance the books here at Walmart. Like, you ain't got a clue, and neither did Jim Herd, okay? Just because he at one point in time worked in a TV situation with Sam Mushnick did not mean in any way, shape, or form he understood wrestling. So what I feel like Jim Herd's view is is, yeah, I understand wrestling. I watch that WWF all the time. And that's, they're like, well, that's not the company you're running. You're running WCW. And he's like, well, this looks stupid. These people are like acting like this is real. We need clowns, and bears would be great, and lumberjacks, and you know what'd be awesome? Hunchbacks, because you can't pin them. They'll just roll around. This would be awesome. Let's take a couple guys, put them in absolutely nondescript outfits and masks, and hang jingle bells all over them, and we'll call them the Ding Dongs. And that blonde-headed 40-year-old fella, what the hell? Let's get rid of him. Tell him to cut his hair. He's the Spartan now. This is the kind of it's like you would just sit there with your mouth agape thinking, I'm on candid camera, right? Okay, so that's Jim Herd, and he's in charge, believe it or not. Well, Ric Flair says, I ain't having, I'm out, and guess what? Fatso, I'm taking my belt with me. And they're like, that's the world title belt. You can't do that. Well, as it turns out, dating back to the old days of the NWA, the champion had to put up a bond to hold the belt. The reason being, if he jumped to another promotion, they'd get his money. And that kept people from double crossing and things like that. And so Ric Flair's like, fine, keep the check. I'll keep the belt. And jump to the WWF as the WCW NWA World Heavyweight Champion. Then, and back then, I know it's hard to believe now, back then, championships mattered. Now, they didn't matter as much in 1991 as they mattered in like 1981, where this would have been a promotion-killing stunt. It was still a pretty big deal, make no mistake about it. So Ric Flair's like, well, do what you want to. See you later, and I'm taking the belt with me. Now, he actually agrees to do business on his terms. He's like, okay, you want me to drop the belt? I promised Sting I would drop the belt to him, and that's who I'll drop it to. Well, they ended up kind of negotiating around, and it's like, well, I'll tell you what, I'll drop it to Barry Windham. Barry Windham can be the transitional champion, and they're like, nope, that's not what we want you to do. And at the end of the day, he's just like, well, you can call whoever you want to, champion. I'm out of here, and I'm taking the belt with me. Watch WWF TV. You'll see it there soon enough. So I'm going now to the Wrestling Observer newsletter, July the 8th, 1991. Now, Andrew, when we get to your question, when it comes up about what the NWA thinks about all this, we'll see we'll follow that thought experiment up and see if things could have went differently and what it would have mattered. But for everyone here, we're going to actually look at this and see what happened. Here's another question I want to address. This one's always bothered me, and it's bothered many fans. A statement is made amongst many hardcore wrestling fans, and the statement goes, WWF botched Ric Flair's jump to their promotion as champion by not having Ric Flair versus Hulk Hogan take place at WrestleMania. This would have been WrestleMania 13. No, I'm sorry, 8. WrestleMania 8. I don't know where I got 13 from. 8. WrestleMania 7 had just happened. That was Sergeant Slaughter against Hulk Hogan. Obviously, not the best WrestleMania ever. Likewise, in amongst this mix, you just had the steroid trial. WWF was reeling from that. Hulk Hogan's about to go on Arsenio Hall and make an idiot out of himself. WWF clearly needs some help, and they've clearly got some distractions going on and problems. But the idea, and I think the good idea, is that match should have headlined WrestleMania 8. Dave Meltzer, on the other hand, and other, let's, for lack of a better term, call them observers of wrestling, say, oh no, this it fizzled out, it didn't draw that well, there's no way it could have went. Okay, all right, doing it the way they done it, that's true, but let's do it differently. They should have never rushed it into that quick. This was one of the biggest events that had ever happened in wrestling history. The top, the most respected world heavyweight champion, had just jumped to WWF. Not only that, but he jumped with the belt while still champion. Now, while this is in July of 1991, you've still got a long way to go to get to WrestleMania of the following year. But you can do it by doing it slowly, more slowly than they did. You didn't have to rush him into a program with Roddy Piper and Randy Savage and on everybody else he did until they started doing house shows. Why did they ever even do? You should have never put Hogan and Flair on any house show. That was a terrible decision. The first time those two ever got in the ring together to look at each other should have been at WrestleMania VIII, each of them holding a belt, staring at each other across the ring, and should have been to unify those titles. Now, a lawsuit comes out of this, and we'll certainly talk about that, where he couldn't have been WCW champion, and NWA stripped him at close to the same time of their recognition, but still, in the minds of everyone, he hadn't lost that belt. Ric Flair didn't do a job for anybody over that. He was still World Heavyweight Champion. You still could have called him, without letters, World Heavyweight Champion, and they did. They said, like, the real belt and things like that. They worked around it. I would have called him the World Heavyweight Champion. Now, could they have worked a deal with NWA to keep those three letters? Probably so. In this era, I imagine it wouldn't take much to have bought that. Maybe a $25,000 check from Vince McMahon to Dennis Corluzzo or whoever was in charge of things, who said, hey, we want to rent that belt for the next year, or from July to April of next year. $25,000 for 9 months, probably worth it to the independent version of the NWA. All right, so let's jump now to these observers. Let's go to our summaries, and then we'll deep dive if we need to go any further. This is the July 8th, 1991 Wrestling Observer newsletter. The big story this week is that WCW has fired Ric Flair after the two sides failed to agree on a contract extension. It's been announced that Ric Flair has been stripped of the title, and that the top two contenders, Barry Windham and Lex Luger, will face each other to Great American Bash pay-per-view in a cage match. It's the first time in the 43-year lineage of the NWA WCW that title didn't change hands in the ring. So that's super significant right there, right? The contract offered would have cut Flair's salary more than half, which naturally Ric Flair balked at. On the same hand, WCW took major losses last year and has been starting to make significant cuts. Ric Flair is seen as being on the downswing of his career and has been mostly used to help create stars out of Sting and Lex Luger. Also of note is that Ric Flair owns the current championship belt, well, sort of, so WCW will need to get a new title belt that turns into its own big story in the coming weeks. That's the summary of this, and we all know what kind of happened. So that's your lead up there. Let's go now to the summary for the July 15th, 1991 Observer newsletter. Fallout from WCW's firing of Ric Flair has been huge. The story got picked up in national newspapers around the country, and almost all the coverage has been sympathetic to Flair, with some media outlets in Charlotte even calling for a WCW boycott. From here, Dave recounts the long story of how we got to this point. Starting with the contract negotiations last year, WCW has been cutting costs due to huge losses, and Flair had the largest contract in the company, so naturally, it's not surprising they wanted to make some cuts there. On the other hand, in the last year, WCW has offered Sid Vicious more money than that to stay, and they offered Randy Savage more than that to jump ship from WWF. Both men turned the deals down. Another issue was WCW's booking of Flair. He was clearly being de-emphasized within the company, as they have made no secret about slowly phasing him out and pushing newer, younger stars like Sting and Lex Luger. In fact, Ric Flair hasn't even really had much in the way of storylines for quite a while now, despite being the World Heavyweight Champion. The small programs he has had with Tatsumi Fujinami and El Gigante weren't really the primary focus of the show or heavily promoted. Another interesting note is that the NWA announced that they are still recognizing Ric Flair as the world champion, even if WCW doesn't. Doesn't mean much in the big picture, but Flair can still legally work claiming to himself to be NWA world champion. The lineages of WCW and NWA championships start getting murky and confusing from here. But the big takeaway from this is that Ric Flair could, in theory, go to WWF as the NWA World Champion, and a champion versus champion match with Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania would be a huge draw. See, everybody has speculated about this, even Dave. But Dave doubts Vince will even consider it because doing so would mean acknowledging another wrestling organization, which is something Vince just won't do. Well, we know now from history he did basically do everything but say that, and he would have said that if he legally could have. So that ends up, in fact, not being entirely true. WCW has lost several of its big names of the past few years: Ricky Steamboat, the Road Warriors, Sid Vicious, Terry Funk, etc. But this one seems to have struck a nerve. Loud chants of "We want Flair" have been hijacking all WCW live events since the news broke. And while this isn't directly related to the story, at the same time, this issue of the Observer tells us that Hulk Hogan is appearing on the Arsenio Hall show soon, and due to pressure from media and sponsors, it's expected Hulk Hogan will make a confession and apology on the show. Well, we know how that all turns out, but this is the world Ric Flair is walking into. WWF is taken a huge negative hit in their overall, the way that the press is talking about them. I mean, they are the black sheep of the entertainment world, even more so than they ever were. This is the world Ric Flair is walking into, belt and all. Now, the next issue of Wrestling Observer, which was the July 29th, 1991 issue, was basically mostly about Hulk Hogan and the being on Arsenio Hall and the fact he did not confess or, apologize for anything. Basically lied and said, "Oh, well, steroids? What? I remember getting banged up one time around 1983, I think, when I was world champion, and he wasn't world champion in 1983. And they gave me some vitamins and stuff. There might have been some steroids. I'm making fun of this. You all know what happened. He got on there and didn't accept responsibility for nothing, and there was a huge backlash against it. Now, as far as anything about Flair in this issue, the only thing I've got of note in the summary here was Jim Herd was interviewed on NBC Sports Machine's show and says no one was sadder than he was to see Ric Flair leave. Flair declined to be interviewed on the advice of his lawyer, leading some to expect a lawsuit may be filed against WCW. In the August 5th, 1991 edition of Wrestling Observer, my birthday, ironically, we get some Dave speculation. So this is what Dave's speculating about. Nothing's confirmed yet, but the rumor is that Ric Flair will debut at SummerSlam and challenge Hulk Hogan to a title versus title match. The real issue determining whether or not that will happen depends on whether WWF is willing to acknowledge another promotion or championship other than their own, which is something Vince just doesn't do. Well, we know everything in that first statement ends up being wrong. Meanwhile, we want Flair chants have been heard at every WCW event since he left, and even during an Atlanta Braves baseball game, loud enough that the baseball announcers had to acknowledge it. Wow. I'd actually completely forgot about that. In more belt news, WCW has ordered a new world title belt. This would be the one that Vader would end up having. I guess he's the one I most associate with that. Lex Luger, of course. They paid $17,000 for it to replace the one that Ric Flair took when he left. That was the Crumb Rind belt that's, north of $40,000 belt. In the meantime, Lex Luger has been using, and I kid you not, this is true. There's pictures. You can Google this up on the internet. He's been using the old Florida belt that they went to a trophy shop, got a little plate that said World Heavyweight Champion, and kind of fixed it on there. It's the most generic thrift shop looking belt you've ever seen in your life. That's the one they used for a minute there. Now, just to kind of, again, put you in a time capsule, if you're sitting there thinking, what is WCW thinking? Well, this is what WCW is thinking, because at this exact same time, Brian Pillman has been running around as the yellow dog. They bring Billy Jack Haynes in, who has national exposure with WWF previously, super well known in the Pacific Northwest, very well known in Florida, got a lot of magazine coverage, so they put a mask on him and call him Black Blood, pay him $300 a night, and he goes nowhere. They also, and get this is, you never hear this talked about either. I don't know why this is kind of fallen out of the stories told about Bill Hurd. You know, you get stuck on the ding-dongs and the hunchbacks. Well, here's some more Hurd ideas for you. This kind of fell out of, memory. There were plans for a Halloween Havoc match called the Master of the Maze. In this, wrestlers will face off in a transparent plexiglass maze. Yes. Now, this predates Chamber of Horrors, by the way. Actually, they end up going with Chamber of Horrors. The plexiglass maze, Master of the Maze, was the original idea. Not only that, but if you thought Chamber of Horrors was hilariously awesome, and it was, if you thought to yourself, wow, the only thing that could be better or / worse than that would be Master of the Maze, hang on to your hats, folks. The original plan for Clash of Champions was a Georgia red clay match with a ring made up of something like quicksand. The idea was basically a reverse battle royal where a bunch of guys go in and the first one to escape would be the winner. Now, I'm not sure if they escaped from the quicksand or if I hope actually is the quicksand's on the floor and they get thrown out of the ring into the quicksand. Like Black Blood takes a tumble with his axe and you throw a hunchback in on top of it. Good God, it's the ding dong. He's in the quicksand. Tony, it's the ding dong. Oh my, he got his ding dong in the quicksand. Oh God. Karl, bring it back together. Good God, Tony. All right. August 12th, 1991. Everybody survived the quicksand, I suppose. August 12th, 1991, here. WWF recorded voiceovers on shows mentioning Ric Flair's name and referring to him as the, quote, World Heavyweight Champion. The initials NWA and WCW won't be used for obvious reasons, but this is still interesting because it's the first time WWF has acknowledged another promotion since 1984, when they purchased Georgia Championship Wrestling. Billing him as the other world champion obviously means he's being set up for a feud with Hulk Hogan. Also noteworthy is that they are talking about Ric Flair on TV despite the deal not being finalized yet. For legal reasons, WWF can't even officially negotiate with Flair until his WCW contract expires on September 1st, but Vince must be extremely confident that Flair is coming in if he's already recording promos. In the meantime, Bobby Heenan will appear as Flair's advocate long before Paulie Dangerously with Flair's world title belt, the big gold crumb rind belt. However, WCW made a last-ditch effort to get Ric Flair back. Sources say WCW offered Ric Flair the job as booker, but Flair turned them down. Obviously, if they're offering the job to Flair, it doesn't bode well for Dusty Rhodes, who's taken much of the criticism, along with Jim Herd, for the disastrous state of WCW and losing their biggest star without even getting the world title off him first, making it look even worse. But word is both men are probably safe until their contracts expire. I just had a... What? They put El Gigante in the quicksand match. And let's say Black Blood throws him over the top rope. But El Gigante's so tall, he only sinks up to his knees while everybody else is like reaching up for him to pull. And like El Gigante spends most of the time at ringside, like pulling people up from the quicksand while he's like waist deep in or something. That, my friends, is money. Word is both men are probably safe until their contracts expire, especially Dusty because he is on a guaranteed deal and WCW would have to pay his full contract even if they dumped him. By the way, if you think WCW Turner ought to be getting enough of this crap, well, this is when Bill Watts' name starts surfacing as somebody coming in. Bill Watts' name's coming up a lot lately when it comes to the future of WCW. Bill Watts recently did an interview. Boy, did he ever. When it come back to haunt him, where he pretty much bashed all the Turner executives and essentially said WCW sucks and they don't have the balls to bring him in because they know he's telling the truth and they don't want truth tellers. They only want corporate butt kissers. Apparently they didn't also want people with antiquated racial ideas, which he also espoused in this interview that got him ended up being axed. So in here somewhere must have been where NWA stripped him of the title. So let's go actually to the actual Observer newsletter. So that was August 12th. So let's go, need to go back a page here. Let's go to August, June. Do we not have August in the news? Well, yeah, there it is, August 12th, and see. Let me see if I can find anything regarding the NWA here. So let me do Control F, type in the words NWA, which only appears 3 times in this newsletter, so that's probably not it. What we already talked about that being here. Then in EMLL, they talk about those. Okay, so that's nothing to do with the NWA stripping him there. Let's go back one to August 5th. And see if we can find anything about the NWA there. Okay, NWA appears several times in this. This week's speculation regarding Ric Flair goes something like this. Flair will debut for the WWF at SummerSlam at Madison Square Garden with the NWA belt. So that's the first time that word appears. Okay. Flair has told independent promoters that he isn't interested in doing indies until September and has agreed to at least one date that I know of with Joel Goodhart in September as NWA champion, provided that he isn't with one of the major promotions. Well, that never happened, but he must still be champion there. Ross was somewhat critical of Flair claiming to be NWA champion since the organization doesn't even promote wrestling on a regular basis and really doesn't even exist except in name. All right, so that's what, here's, all right. The consensus of thought is that if Flair were to go to Titan, recognized as NWA champion with the belt, that his match with Hulk Hogan would have more box office appeal than any match on the short-term horizon. So that seems to be the train of thought at the time, Andrew, that other people were very much thinking about that. Let's see here. That's the only mentions of the NWA World Heavyweight Championship here in this issue. All right, so we know up to there. Let's go now to the summary of, that was August 12th. Let's go to the summary of August 26, 1991. And looks like the narrative in this switches back to the steroid trial, and superstar Billy Graham is threatening to sue WWF over things that were said in the steroid trial. Bruno Sammartino and he's talking about this as well. Okay, there's still no clear picture of what's going to happen with Ric Flair. It looks as though he's scheduled to work house shows with Roddy Piper at first, but Hulk Hogan's been recording promos where he mentions Ric Flair as well. If they hold off on Hogan versus Flair at first, and so now, you know, we're well over into August, we can't even do anything till September, so that's shortening the gap there. If they hold off on Hogan versus Flair at first, then it will likely headline WrestleMania. Yeah, I mean, that's sure what it looks like. If they jump straight into that storyline as soon as Flair comes in, they'll probably blow it off before then, and something else will headline Mania, which is exactly what happens. And that is not very good. Here's another mention here. WCW Chamber of Horrors match has been confirmed for Halloween Havoc. Dave doesn't know what it is, but it may be a plexiglass maze match. So he's kind of reporting that again. Let's see here if there's anything else Flair related here. Ric Flair's attorney has said that they will take legal action against WCW for wrongful termination in regards to Flair's firing. Meanwhile, WCW is now claiming they have legal ownership of Ric Flair's belt, saying that it is one of the pieces of property that TBS purchased when they bought Jim Crockett Promotion in 1988. This would turn into a much bigger story soon, obviously, although it ends up Ric Flair being right that he's got this bond up. Okay, he's got this $25,000, I believe, that it's ruled, I'm pretty sure a lawsuit comes up of this, that is ruled that, yeah, WCW can have their belt back, but they've got to return Flair's money, and which they do. Remember, the belt ends up, while this is happening, ends up being digitized out on TV, and then they ultimately replace it with, I think, a WWF tag team title belt, or an old one, as to represent this mythical, at that point, quote, World Heavyweight Championship. So that was unfortunate there. Let's see here. That was the 26th. So let's go to September 6th. And September 6th, 1991. There's bigger fish to fry at the moment because Ultimate Warrior got sent home from WWF for unprofessional conduct. This is when he was no-showing some shows and stuff. Or actually tried to hold them up for money at SummerSlam, I believe was the deal. Let's see here. In Ric Flair news, Hogan versus Flair is scheduled to headline several house shows next month, but there's no word on how Hogan-Flair feud will play on TV. So it looks like right here, right at the very beginning of September 1991, is where the lapse of judgment occurred, where somebody had to be Vince. I mean, something of this nature, this magnitude, had to be Vince making this call that they were going straight to the house shows with this. Just absolutely, I mean, for all the credit, sometimes rightfully, often wrongly, Vince McMahon gets as this supposed wrestling genius, he makes a lot of miscalculations. And this, in my opinion, is a very, very big one. All right, I think Jim Herd was quoted last week saying that Flair had never told the truth in his whole life. Ric Flair's attorney demanded a retraction from Herd or he would file a defamation of character lawsuit. After several back and forths with Herd saying he was misquoted, TBS has agreed to print a retraction in the paper where the quote originated. All right, so I think that's all of the Flair news in that issue. So let's go down to September 9th, 1991. Top story is still about Ultimate Warrior getting suspended or whatever the deal was, whatever you want to, terminology you want to call it there. Let's see here. I don't see any Flair news right there. Okay. In other WCW craziness, since back in 1989 when he took over WCW, Jim Herd has been pitching an idea for a team called the Hunchbacks, who would have backs so rounded that their shoulders could never touch the mat, and thus they couldn't be pinned. He has been talked out of it time and time again, but recently pitched the idea again, this time contacting Kevin Sullivan and asking him to be one of the Hunchbacks. I've never heard that story before. I don't remember it, that Kevin Sullivan was supposed to be one of the Hunchbacks. Wow. All right, September 23rd, 1991. Okay, top story in this one is the suicide of Chris Von Erich, the age of 25. Not going to talk any more about that because in a couple weeks I have, from the pages of The Observer, the complete story of Kerry Von Erich's suicide, and it's really more a retrospective piece on the entire Von Erich family than just the story of Kerry Von Erich's death. It is very long and very detailed. I've already recorded it, so I'm going to hold off anything about that till then. But this has precedent. Okay, here's a problem with our idea, Andrew, as far as Flair coming in being the NWA World Champion. I'd actually forgotten about this. Jim Herd has been named as president of the National Wrestling Alliance. What that means is that WCW becomes the controlling power in the NWA, and Lex Luger, therefore, becomes recognized as NWA champion. Remember, a few weeks back, the NWA voted to recognize Flair as still being the NWA champion even after he left WCW. Since the NWA is pretty much a meaningless organization at this point, the only reason this really matters is that it puts into question just who legally owns the NWA Championship belt, which is currently appearing on WWF television. Both Flair and WCW have claimed legal ownership, and of course, there's about to be a lawsuit about this and everything. But so Flair's on TV now. He's come in with Bobby Heenan as his advocate, manager, whatever. They are actually showing the Crumrine big gold WCW belt there on TV. Now, to me, debuting Ric Flair on this little studio show, prime time, was a little talk show type deal, and not at a major arena, not in a major hot TV angle of some sort, or at a pay-per-view, was another big misstep to me. It looked very rinky-dink, bringing him out. Now, mind you, both Bobby Heenan and Ric Flair were great in this segment, but you had a bunch of geek not a bunch, you had a few geek fans there in the audience who were just there, and it looked very cheesy. I mean, it looked very low rent, and so to me, I think that was another fumble. But let's listen to Ric Flair debut on this show in WWF. This is the introduction of Ric Flair into WWF.
Everything's going to run smooth tonight. The real world champion Ric Flair's on my show. He's going to be coming through. You, sir, don't touch that belt. You nitwit. Sit down. Do something. Hey, guys, keep busy. Keep busy. Ric Flair's on my program tonight. The real world's champion. You got it? Let's go. Let's get a tie that matches. What are you doing? You still working here? You're fired. Come on. Come on. This way. This way. This way. Hey. Hey. What are you, down that Hulk Hogan 900 number again, or are you calling dial a date? Get to work, do something. And you get a haircut, drop that ponytail. Don't you own a dress? Who dresses you, the state? Put that sweater on, cover your up, someplace. I'm a little nervous tonight. I want things to be right. Nice hat, pulled down over your face. It's a very important night. Be busy, do something. Come on, dummy, come on. Now, it's time. Live and in living color. The greatest world's heavyweight champion in the history of this great sport. And it's my pleasure to introduce, you got it, the real world's champion, Ric Flair. Let's hear it. Stand up. There you go, stand. Everybody stand. Everybody up.
First of all, let me get to a guy by the name of Roddy Piper. Because, Piper, before I get wound up on Hogan, you and I got a little short bit of business to take care of. In my absence, the greatest mind in our sport brought my World Heavyweight Championship trophy out on national television. Not to be braggadocious, not to show off, but merely to let the world know that the real world's heavyweight champion was going to be coming to the WWF. Well, lo and behold, did you think it wasn't going to happen? Did you think the greatest mind in this sport would walk out here with $75,000 worth of pure gold and blow smoke? Well, if you did, you were wrong. So, Roddy Piper, when you took off those earphones and walked from behind that desk with your cute little skirt on and walked over and spit on this and grabbed him, you put yourself in permanent retirement, because now, Piper, you got to wrestle the real world heavyweight champion. And if you're honest with yourself, you know, Piper, what the real deal is all about.
What are you going to do the first time you see Mr. Piper?
What? Right across the face. I'm going to hit you so hard, Piper, your skirt's going to fall to your ankles. And then what are you going to do? Who are you going to spit on laying on your back, Hot Rod? Now.
Excuse me, Eric. I think you should mention about how many times, how many years you challenged Hulk Hogan.
Well,
unanswered.
For 10 years, it's been two names, Hogan and Flair. Hogan, the WWF champion, Ric Flair, the real world's heavyweight champion. Well, now,
they don't know any better. They will.
Now, let's bring this down to something that Hogan will have to understand. You don't ignore this. My name's Ric Flair, and I'm going to burst that bubble, big man. And henceforth, big man, Hogan, wherever you walk, in any major airport, in any department store, in any hotel lobby, the question is going to be in your face from everyone. Can you beat Ric Flair? You're going to have to wrestle him, Hulk. I mean, Hulk, you're our hero. You're the man. And Hogan, that's when you're going to have to look inside. You're going to have to say to yourself, well, yeah, am I? I don't know. Well, I know. I'm Ric Flair. And I'm the real world champion. I know. How about that, brain? I guess what I'm saying is, Hogan, put up or shut up.
All right. Here's the Observer's actual story on Jim Herd becoming president of the NWA, which again killed any chance of WWF. And before this, WWF, in my opinion, should have. I mean, again, it's just a promotion that exists on paper. They should have dumped maybe $25,000 in the lap of whomever is running that thing at that point and said, look, let us just license the name NWA for, a year. And, after WrestleMania, you can, quietly strip Ric Flair of the NWA title, maybe say, look, we don't recognize Hulk Hogan, who would have maybe won the match. I don't know. Maybe Ric Flair wins the match. Probably does, quite frankly, win the match. And, maybe come up with their own storyline reason, or maybe they lease it into perpetuity. Well, what's NWA doing about it right now to make any money? They don't do anything with it for a while to make any money. Well, actually, Bill Watts is about to come in and replace this super creative force that is Jim Herd. And so he does a deal with the NWA and gets their name back out there, but they're not really making any money. McMahon could have, even with all the problems he's going through right now, out of basically pocket change, could have leased that thing, and it would have been a bigger deal. But here's where that goes off the rails, and it says, in a related development on Sunday on the Jim Ross radio show in Atlanta, Jim Ross announced that Jim Herd had just been named the new president of the National Wrestling Alliance. That announcement probably meant nothing to the listening audience, but what it really meant was that a meeting in Charlotte on Friday, World Championship Wrestling became the controlling power in the nebulous NWA. By virtue of it, Lex Luger was instilled as NWA champion. WCW will again become WCW and use the NWA name as the sanctioning body, and the NWA name will be used on television once again, although that was very off and on, and NWA certainly always took a back seat to the WCW and branding, and probably rightfully so. I mean, they independently controlled the name NWA and NWA World Champion. WCW Turner fully controlled WCW World title. The NWA initials hadn't been used with the WCW for the past several months, and in July, the NWA board voted to recognize Ric Flair as champion rather than go along with WCW's decision to strip Flair of the title when he was fired. So that's July. This is September. So basically, if you're looking at title histories, Ric Flair was NWA World Champion about 2 months longer than he was WCW World Champion by this. Apparently, the NWA board, whose legal counsel was Dennis Guthrie, who is also Ric Flair's attorney, interestingly enough, and a way WWF could have pulled this off. They had 7 members. The voting power, at least as far as the ability to control the NWA Championship, was in the hands of those who aren't actually even promoting wrestling these days. The 7-member board consisted of Jim Crockett, Gary Juster, Jim Hurd, Larry O'Day from Australia, Steve Rickard Sr., Steve Rickard Jr., both based in New Zealand, who rarely promote wrestling these days, and 1 vote split between Karl and Elliot Murnick, who are ex-NWA promoters who were dumped by Hurd. So there is pretty much a split on that board there. O'Day, apparently after being convinced by Jim Barnett of the WCW office to switch his allegiance to the WCW contingent of Crockett, Juster, and Hurd. And 4 votes were enough to make Hurd the new NWA president and also give WCW the power to control the NWA Championship. Say they wouldn't have even had to bought the license, the name through there. I mean, I guess they could have there. They could have just bought some of these board members, to got them to vote their way. While this really means nothing, the real reason behind all this is a continuing battle over just who owns the NWA Championship belt, and perhaps a method of fighting back by WCW, which had been publicly embarrassed by Ric Flair leaving the promotion with the championship belt and appearing on WWF television with it. It is somewhat unclear as to who actually owns the belt, as Flair claims ownership based on a contract settlement for money owed him by Jim Crockett when Crockett's debt overwhelmed him in 1988. WCW claimed ownership, believing that the belt was one of the things Turner Broadcasting purchased when it purchased Jim Crockett Promotions in 1988. And there was talk this past week that they were going to take steps to legally gain possession of the belt, this apparently being that step. What is clear is that Ric Flair was going to have to be paid the value of the belt by WCW when it came time for him to lose it. However, as NWA champion, WCW didn't have the legal right to buy the belt back from Flair. It's not clear if they even do now, but certainly it strengthens their legal claim. Now, it is interesting to note a little factoid about the Crumb Ryan belt. If you notice, that belt doesn't say NWA anywhere on it. Now, originally in the plans drawn up for the Crumb Ryan Jewelry Company that made the belt, the letters NWA were originally at the top of the belt, but in the final sketches, they were left out. Now, the theory is that Jim Crockett, even back then when he had this belt produced in 1986, was even that far back considering leaving the NWA and going his own way, or having that belt as like a generic world championship, because he saw the diminishing value of the National Wrestling Alliance. I mean, Jim Crockett basically became the power broker and the booker for the NWA World Champion in that post WWF National Expansion era. So it is very interesting. The belt that they're arguing over, the big gold belt, doesn't say NWA anywhere on it. Just says World Heavyweight Champion. It's very interesting. If you've never read that WCW or the big gold belt book, whatever it's called, it's just well worth checking out. I hope you'll purchase that through one of our Amazon links. That helps us. But I've got the book, and it's very, very interesting. So that's what really was the deal there with Hurd coming into power there, the NWA. So let's go now to November the 4th, 1991. And here we already fumble the ball. Okay, so we've already, in my opinion, these missteps have already happened. Number one, like Andrew brought up, they didn't somehow influence the NWA board into ceding power or rights licensing to the WWF. That was really mistake number one. As soon as Flair jumped, as soon as Flair made it clear he was leading, that should have been step number one, was to go secure recognition of Flair as NWA champion from the NWA board and work out some sort of licensing agreement. They did not do that. That was misstep number one. Misstep number two was not slow rolling his debut over the course of multiple weeks, if not a couple months, where Flair just shows up Hulk Hogan, shows up, flashing his belt around, claiming to be, everybody knows who the real world champion is, that sort of thing, instead of rushing him into programs, putting him right on TV and everything else. The third misstep was debuting him in front of that cheesy-looking, low-rent crowd on what was it, Prime Time, whatever the name of that show was. They debuted him on there in that in-studio deal, just low rent. And here's the next one. This is the big one. One of the biggest dream matches in wrestling history finally took place as the most popular wrestler of all time, Hulk Hogan, faced the greatest wrestler of all time, Ric Flair, at several house shows this week. This is November of 1991. Okay, so 5 months before WrestleMania VIII, they're already put this match out there. Bad idea. It run out of steam weeks before it ever got to WrestleMania VIII. This, in my opinion, was the biggest misfire of the whole deal. For the most part, the matches were good but not great, and the finish on most nights was Flair hitting Hogan with a foreign object and getting the pin and seemingly winning the WWF title, only for the referee to reverse the decision after finding the weapon. Also, I get a strange joy out of watching Dave Meltzer's predictions turn out to be wrong. This says the person doing the write-up. He talks about how Hogan versus Flair is the start of perhaps both men's final runs in the business. Not even close. Oh my gosh, they've got massive times ahead of them. Both these guys do. Flair's got a WWF title run ahead of him. Hogan's got the NWO, where he probably made close to as much money as he did at certain times during his Hulkamania run. No, they're far from done. Far from done. He talks about Hogan versus, let's see here. He talks about how Hogan versus Flair is the start of perhaps both men's final runs in the business. And then he talks about how Flair is in WWF now to finish out his career. That's not true either. All right, let's see here. What else we have so far as relates to Flair and Hogan. By the way, that week they had the Halloween Havoc Chamber of Horrors match, which did not, in fact, take place in a plexiglass maze, nor did they have the much-anticipated quicksand match. And that, I'm afraid, is a loss for all of us. Okay, so let's go now to... Oh, we jumped, by the way. I jumped entirely to the wrong one. That was November. We're way back in September here. See where I'm at. I'm all discombobulated here. I'm in quicksand. Come on now. Let's see if there's anything between. I think for the most part that is because in October there shouldn't have been really anything much Flair Hogan related. Of course, we do get Flair coming in. Doing this, see here's October 7th. See what kind of Flair stuff we have here. Hogan's doing the rounds, still talking about steroids and stuff, which is a terrible idea. Nothing about Flair in that issue. October 21st, 91. This is Paul E. Dangerously, by the way, is coming back into, or is coming into WCW. Okay. WCW has already filed a claim to get the NWA title back. Flair is willing to sell it back to them for $50,200. I don't know where the $200 comes in. Then, assuming they had got the belt back by then at the okay. Now here's one that's also forgotten about: the famous Memphis Jerry Lawler winning the NWA World title angle, which was spoiled supposedly by Paul E. Dangerously. He or Eddie Gilbert once supposedly told this to Dave. Dave reported it, and they suspend Paul E. Dangerously, who, as it turns out, had nothing to do with it. And he sues WCW, which ends up putting him back on TV and I think paying him some money for screwing that up. But yes, there was a plan for the NWA title, a tournament to crown a new NWA champion, and Jerry Lawler would win. It would be Jerry Lawler, NWA champion, versus Lex Luger, WCW champion. And then there was another scenario where it would be Jerry Lawler winning the WCW World title from Lex Luger. Obviously, that was all dropped, as it never happened, clearly. But it was dropped because it leaked, and they blamed it on Paul E. Dangerously, which he didn't do, and he sued and won. All right. Finally, I jumped again to November, but October, let's see if there's October 28th issue. Let's see if there's anything more about that. About Ric Flair, I don't see anything here. Oh, they did. This is the week they did the Cobra bites Randy Savage, Jake Roberts' Cobra bites Randy Savage angle. It was taped. They got Sergeant Slaughter trying to turn back babyface after turning on his country. Nothing there about Flair. That rhymed. All right, so that's got us up to November. All right, so that was November 4th. We just talked about the first ever Hogan Flair match. So let's go now to November 11th, 1991, and I'm actually not doing the summaries anymore. I'm actually looking in the actual Wrestling Observer newsletter. There is nothing about the NWA in this issue. Let's see about Flair. Flair is mentioned 34 times in this issue. The second weekend of the Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair series of matches saw bouts held in Pittsburgh, Moline, Champaign, Milwaukee, and Denver. Business was generally good, but nowhere near record-breaking. Biggest house of the weekend was November 1st. That's right, because nobody believes the unification bout between WWF and what might as well be NWA is going to take place in Moline, Illinois. Nobody believes that. Or Milwaukee, Wisconsin. No offense to those places, but it ain't happening in Birmingham, Alabama either, nor Huntsville. It would happen, if anywhere, at WrestleMania. Why are they even doing this? It doesn't make any sense. None. And when business, which already sucks to high heaven because they've been caught with their pants down literally doing steroids, and Hulk Hogan got on Arsenio Hall and lied about doing steroids, and Ultimate Warrior is getting pushed to the moon, and he says, you know what, I'm going home, and he does. That's why business is horrible right here. And they're blaming it, going, oh, well, we put Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair together and only did 10,800 in some of these cities, and it should have done a lot better than that. 7,800 in Milwaukee. Well, no kidding, because your promotion is bottomed out through reasons not related to that. It's not going to bounce right back. They could have built things back up between there and WrestleMania VIII. Instead, they go for the quick. Instead of the millions of dollars they could have made at WrestleMania VIII by holding this off, they're instead getting $125,000 payoffs in Pittsburgh and 6,400 people in Denver, and none of this makes any sense. Let's see here. In Pittsburgh and Milwaukee, the matches went similar to Oakland, Los Angeles matches from previous weekend with the reverse decision DQs. In those matches, Jimmy Hart was managing Ric Flair instead of Bobby Heenan, who's bothered with a neck injury and has been taken off the road. While this isn't confirmed, word we have is that Ric Flair will be given a new manager permanently, which won't be Hart, and that no decision has been made as to who it will be. Oh, that didn't happen. Although they do put Kurt Hennig with him, right? They had a new finish on Monday night in Denver, with him working into the same spot where Hart gives Flair a foreign object, and he hits Hogan with it. But in Denver, Hogan kicked out of the pin, and the two brawled around ringside, with Hogan running Flair into the post, and he jumped in to win the match by countout, then posed after the match. This different finish is most likely because they aren't coming back with an immediate rematch in Denver. So, yeah, I mean, this is just bad booking. I mean, there's no other way. Dave glosses over that when he says, well, Dave is always about facts and figures, okay? And that's his strength, and he is great at it. There's nobody better. If you make a statement, hey, this X equals Y, Dave will come back and say, no, it's because A, B, and C equals actually D and all this, without taking in the entire picture. Okay, yes, it is a factual statement to say Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair did not draw very good at these initial house shows. That's true, but that is not the totality of the story. The totality of the story is the Ring Boy sex abuse scandal led to a huge popularity hit for WWF, which was come right before the steroid trial, which was a huge popularity hit for WWF, which came on Hulk Hogan going on Arsenio Hall and making a fool out of himself in WWF, and that took another popularity hit. And Ric Flair just happens to come in at the same time, and so business isn't as great as it should be awesome. Well, no, because they've sunk this promotion, and it's going to take a little while for them to recover. It's not, correlation does not equal causation. I mean, we all know that, right? The world is not getting warmer. Global warming's not taking place because there's less pirates in the ocean. There are extenuating circumstances, and Ric Flair is not the cause of this not drawing well. If anything, Hulk Hogan's the cause for getting on Arsenio Hall and being part of the steroid trial and all this other negative publicity that WWE is getting. That's the problem. Let's see here. What else we have in this issue? They added Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair to Springfield. Originally supposed to be Flair and Piper, no doubt to help ticket sales. See, they're using this as their big payday, they're using it as a Band-Aid to help these house shows. They're getting paid. I mean, and this is, we see this in the world. I mean, this is one of the reasons people talk about, why do poor people remain poor a lot of times? Because they spend their money on things that don't give them a good return for their investment. And me say that as a poor person, I understand that. You blow money on small things instead of saving it up and investing it into good returns. That's what they're doing here. They're trying to make a quick buck rather than investing it long term. They're going to buy the proverbial scratch-off lottery ticket instead of putting that money in a CD or something. And it's just bad. It's just bad. I think that's pretty much everything in this issue about Flair. Let's see here. Most of it's just him being advertised. All ad budgets, or at least most, have been sliced in half, this being the WWF. And the card on November 15th at the Cow Palace in San Francisco, headlined by Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair, is an experiment because no outside money is being spent advertising the show. Only using the local television is the only exposure. At last report, the advance for that show is nowhere close to the advance for the first. So again, they're kind of like, this is just poor. This is just a poor use of Flair coming in. Let's see here. Madison Square Garden show, headlined by Ric Flair versus Roddy Piper, drew, this is pretty disappointing, too. Ric Flair versus Roddy Piper drew $145,000, or about $8,500 paid to Madison Square Garden. That's there's some talk. There is talk of taking some major action to try to rebuild the crowds at Madison Square Garden, particularly if Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair on November 30th can't sell out. And I'm sure it didn't. Among things being considered is moving the traditional Monday night shows to Friday or Saturday night, or eliminating the cable broadcast of the shows on MSG Cable. Let's see here. Actually, Pittsburgh outdrew Madison Square Garden by a couple thousand people, so that's not good. Okay, Mark Madden had an article in the Post-Gazette the day of the show with quotes from Ric Flair and Vince McMahon. Ric Flair said, "Coming to the WWF was the biggest moment in my career. I've always felt it was my destiny to wrestle Hulk Hogan. It's as big of an event as there is in sports. It's like Tyson Holyfield. Every wrestling fan will want to see it at least one time." Vince McMahon said, "With Ric Flair's style and brand of charisma, he's a natural counter to Hulk Hogan, a natural rival. I don't see any matchup of this kind coming along anytime soon, but I can't imagine any individual building credibility with another organization like Ric Flair did." I don't really know what that's supposed to mean, but that's what it says. Ric Flair didn't wear his title belt at the house shows this weekend. The hearing, scheduled for Thursday in regards to the ownership of the belt itself, won't be taking place as the sides have agreed to an out-of-the-court settlement. I'm not exactly sure of the settlement, but the National Wrestling Alliance, through TBS, will be paying Ric Flair the $50,200, so that is the figure apparently, to regain possession of the belt itself, but expect another twist in the story next week. Interesting. All right, so let's go now and see what happened the next week. The November 18th, 1991 edition of the Observer newsletter, and the lead story in it is the death of Dick the Bruiser. So the Flair stuff's not headlining there, but let's see. Flair is mentioned 32 times in this issue. Part of this is in the Dick the Bruiser article. Titan Sports has changed its pay-per-view card for December 3rd in San Antonio. We don't have details on the new card, other than one would assume the change in the card also means that there's been significant changes in the overall direction as far as the much speculated upon future course of the WWF title. The new lineup isn't available at press time, but should be pretty obvious after the television tapings that are held Monday through Wednesday of this week. Scheduled as the main event on the pay-per-view show, however, is a Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair match instead of the previously scheduled Hulk Hogan versus Undertaker match. So put that in your pocket for a minute. That's for the December 3rd San Antonio pay-per-view. We'll see what really happens here in a minute. All right, let's see here. The next mention we get of Hogan in news is nothing really significant there. More on Piper, more just results of Piper versus Flair, which they're doing around the Horn, which I think too. That's just I wouldn't have done that. I would have held them all. I would have sporadically brought Ric Flair out maybe once, maybe twice a month up until after the first of the year and just had him goading Hogan on. All right, that's pretty much anything we got there in November 18th. So let's go to November 25th. And the lead story here is WWE debuts a steroid policy, which is, how that goes. All right. So the other major story of the week involves the NWA World Heavyweight Championship belt and the facsimile of such that has just been introduced by WWF. An article by Joseph Min appeared on page 1 of the Charlotte Observer this past Friday, stating the NWA bestowed the belt on the famed Matthews wrestler Ric Flair. I don't know what that's supposed to mean. The Platinum Blonde walked out, taking his belt, woos and grins to the rival WWF. Oh, this is a reporter being cute with wrestling terminology, which never is. See if I can somehow weed my way through this ridiculous wording. The NWA sued the WWF Wednesday because it had been televising Ric Flair wearing its belt, saying statements like, "This is the belt worn by the real world champion." The NWA argued its symbol is being used to benefit the competition. 6 more hours with Ric Flair wearing the NWA belt have been shot to promote an upcoming pay-per-view show. Your Honor, we're going to receive a body blow if these tapes of Ric Flair wearing the NWA belt are shown, charged NWA Tony Fashion Hicks. We'll be the laughing stock of the industry. WWF attorney Theodore Dinsmore countered by saying, a lot of wrestlers in this country have gone around with big flashy gold belt. A belt's a belt. U.S. District Judge Graham Mullen postponed the match with a temporary compromise. The WWF agreed to tell its 300 affiliate stations to cut the belt out of this weekend's television shows. Battle resumes on Thursday. These reporters, I hate it when they try to be so cute with this. I'm putting into the Ultimate History of Pro Wrestling stuff, I put in a whole summary of Sonny Myers' lawsuit against the NWA, and it actually cost a lot of people a lot of money because a judge at the first trial of Sonny Myers versus NWA was so dismissive toward wrestling. He made it a joke. He laughed about it. He didn't take anything seriously, and he ended up getting rebuked for it. He ended up, Sonny Myers lost that case. He ended up getting it reinstated and won the subsequent case, all because the judge was being like, oh, my God, wrestling, you got to be kidding me. I don't care how legit your case is. This is stupid. It's just dumb. Ain't that stuff fake, kind of that sort of thing? Well, I hate it when they do that sort of stuff. It's so ridiculous. Anyway, the Observer continues. What happened this past Thursday was after viewing 2 hours of testimony and videotapes of Ric Flair, Mullen was about to grant the NWA's request for a temporary restraining order banning the WWF from televising Ric Flair with the NWA belt, which he physically gave back last week. Apparently, at some point, there was a claim made by Jim Barnett of World Championship Wrestling that the company had already paid Flair for the belt, but they came up with no proof of payment. The NWA agreed not to press for the restraining order when the WWF agreed to voluntarily edit the belt out of all telecasts this weekend, or so the NWA thought. The WWF felt it agreed to make its best possible effort to get its affiliates to edit out the belt over this past weekend. The WWF's best efforts must not have been very effective since the belt appeared in virtually every market in the country. The NWA apparently would have felt satisfied if the belt was edited out either by digitizing or putting a black spot over it or replacing the segments with Ric Flair wearing the belt. An angle on the funeral parlor involving Undertaker and Flair attacking Hogan, a Survivor Series interview in some markets, a house show promo interviewing for an upcoming card, in all the top 30 markets, and it wouldn't have cared about the smaller markets. As it turns out, to the best of our knowledge, the belt wasn't edited out in any of the top 30 markets, although it was digitized on Primetime Wrestling. Off on a tangent department, the new Primetime format is getting rave reviews from everyone. Monday night, the NWA, Dave is so manic even when, after listening to Dave for so many years and then reading the Observer, he's like, he has to go off on these micro tangents in the middle, like you're reading a sentence and suddenly there's a paragraph of off-topic sidebar, and then you come back and read it's like, it's no wonder the newsletter's like 1.5 million words. The NWA is also requesting that WWF not use the NWA belt or a reasonable facsimile on its television shows. The new belt that Flair is carrying around can easily be construed as a reasonable facsimile, while there is no way of knowing how a judge who knows nothing about wrestling could rule on this subject. If he believes the reasonable facsimile argument, the new belt would more likely than not fall into that category. Actually, this entire story is somewhat ridiculous because whatever damage was done to WCW has already been done. And retrieving the belt or forcing Flair to wear a belt that looks different doesn't accomplish a thing. There's a little more talk about the December 3rd pay-per-view show, saying, well, don't take that Hogan-Flair match as written in stone. They're working on a major angle, and so more to come there. And then they do have the Cow Palace match, apparently. It, okay, so WWF returned to the Cow Palace in San Francisco Friday. I don't know why he doesn't give for some reason, Dave gives the attendance for Oakland, but not for the Cow Palace, right, in San Francisco. Why does he not do this? I don't understand. WWF returned to Cow Palace, San Francisco on Friday, November 15th. It was the first market in which Ric Flair and Hulk Hogan were to have a second meeting. The crowd dropped from 14,900 3 weeks ago in Oakland to a paltry 5,000. So I guess the Cow Palace drew 5,000 for this. So it's fallen off a cliff at this point. Hogan beat Flair by count out in that match. So let's see here if there's anything in the WWF section that hasn't already been covered here. Flair has some matches taped exclusively for Coliseum Video at the December taping against Shawn Michaels and at the January taping against Ted DiBiase. Flair at this point has picked up Curt Hennig, Mr. Perfect, as his new advisor, manager, or whatever. So that's okay. So that's all of any major consequence in the November 25th, 1991 edition of the Observer. So let's go now to December and see if there's anything here. The December 2nd, 1991 edition of Observer. We're done looking for NWA now, although there's more battle for the belt, apparently. And the latest battle for the belt took place on Thursday in Charlotte. As many of you have seen on all the television shows, both in cable and syndication, that aired this past weekend, the clip of the angle where Undertaker and Ric Flair attacked Hulk Hogan has had all the visuals of the NWA World title belt digitized. In court on Thursday, the WWF claimed to have contacted all top 30 markets and market stations and asked them to digitize or somehow obstruct the NWA belt during that angle. And during other portions of the show, the belt aired. And then he kind of recaps what he said last week. Anyway, after viewing more videos of Ric Flair with the belt, the judge denied the NWA's attempt to get a temporary restraining order. The judge ruled that he believed whatever damage has been done to the NWA was largely because the individual Ric Flair appeared on WWF telecast and not because the belt appeared on those telecasts. A reasonable facsimile issue wasn't brought up. However, as of this weekend, Flair was out with yet another different belt. This one, I believe, was an old WWF Tag Team title belt. The WWF emblem was prominent on the belt. It looks nothing like the old NWA title belt. This case may be over, or the NWA could attempt to sue WWF for damages, although in most cases, not every case, if the restraining order is denied, it is generally considered as not worth going to trial over. So that's the saga of the belt. Flair Hogan worked in Chicago with a disappointing crowd of 8,000. Hogan beat Flair there by countout. All right, let's go now to see if there's anything in the WWF section. The next issue of Observer, which is the December 9th, 1991 issue, covers SummerSlam, and Ric Flair participated in the first match of that. He teamed with Ted DiBiase and the Mountie, Jacques Rougeau, and the Warlord, and they defeated Bret Hart, Roddy Piper, and the British Bulldog, and Virgil. And they did digitize the Ric Flair's belt on that one. So that's where that went. Of course, this sets up this is the Undertaker pinned Hulk Hogan to win the WWF Championship. Flair came to ringside, and Hulk Hogan jumped out of the ring and decked him. Then the foot to the face on Undertaker, but Paul Bearer held Hogan's leg, so he couldn't do the leg drop. Ric Flair then put a chair in the ring, and Undertaker gave Hogan a tombstone pile driver on the chair for the win. And, of course, this sets up this Tuesday in Texas. So that's Flair's big involvement in that angle there. Let's see if there's anything else of note. We're only going to go, by the way, until the end of 91 because now we're just getting into Ric Flair. I mean, it's over anything to do with the NWA at this point. He's fully integrated into WWF at this point, and WrestleMania is clearly not happening. Although I am interested to know if at what point Dave gives up on that. December 16th, 1991 Observer. Let's see here. This gives us the results of, where is this Tuesday in Texas pay-per-view. And this is the one that took place on December 3rd that we talked about. 8,000 fans. It was a sellout, actually, to Freeman Coliseum. Ric Flair's involvement in this show was, again, during the Hulk Hogan versus Undertaker match where Hogan appeared to get the world title back. Ric Flair came to ringside and hit Hogan with a chair while Flair fell into Jack Tunney. Flair got back on the apron. Hogan clotheslined him, and when Paul Bearer tried to interfere with the urn, Hogan ducked, so the Undertaker was hit. Hogan then got the urn, threw the ashes into the Undertaker's eyes, and schoolboyed him for the win as Jack Tunney watched. He was then announced as new champion and posed. Of course, we know he's going to end up getting stripped of the belt. He's going to be put up in the Royal Rumble, which Flair wins. So Flair's clearly headed. I mean, even at that point, right? It's definitely more than ever seems like your WrestleMania match has got to be over that disputed title. Flair wins it at the Royal Rumble, and Hulk Hogan got stripped of it. So you got to go WrestleMania with it, right? And of course, that didn't happen. So even as late as December, the end of December, because I'm up to the December 23rd, 91 observers now, you still have to be thinking Ric Flair against Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania VIII. I mean, that's just, I remember I was. Everybody was. All right. So in the December 23rd Observer, they're talking again about what they're drawing. They actually, in Aloha Stadium in Honolulu, they drew 18,000. It was a near sellout. The building held 20,000. A good crowd for Hogan versus Flair. Let's see here. What else? Flair's not mentioned actually a lot in this issue of the Observer. Let's see here. In the WWF section, this is not much about Flair in that one. So now we're going to go. We got to jump years now to 1992, and so if I can find the newsletter archive, 1992. Go all the way to January. Let's see here. So we got to be coming up on, January 27th issues when Flair wins the Royal Rumble. Let's just go ahead and jump to that. January 27th, 92. See whatever kind of discussion we have about Flair heading toward WrestleMania. Ric Flair became the first man ever to actually win both the WWF and NWA World titles on Sunday, January 19th, 1992, to highlight the Royal Rumble pay-per-view from Albany, New York. Show, which drew a legit full house of 17,000 fans, was designed to be and turned out to be Ric Flair's one-man performance. Coming into the Royal Rumble at the 2-minute mark and being there to the end, the end came 1 hour and 2 seconds later. The only other development out of the show was the beginning of the Sid Justice heel turn on Hulk Hogan to end the Rumble. So they're, definitely setting that up. Okay, here's a mention about WrestleMania. Let me find the beginning of Dave's 3-paragraph long sentence here. Without the announcers giving won the impression that it was Justice who turned. And, of course, you would know Dave's sentence begins in the middle of the sentence. Those in the building saw it as Sid Justice throwing Hulk Hogan out, which some would have thought would have been enough to turn one heel, considering Hogan's strong babyface persona, but wasn't live, which was legal in an every man for himself match. But then Hogan, who had been eliminated, teaming with Flair, a heel, to dump Justice, the last remaining babyface in the ring, and allow Ric Flair, a heel, to win the WWF title. This sets up an apparent Ric Flair versus Hulk Hogan main event at WrestleMania on April 5th in Indianapolis. Okay, so this bucks the narrative that Dave has sold for years, which is the reason we didn't get WrestleMania VIII, Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair main event, was because all those house shows they were running did poor business. Well, those have already come and gone. We've already moved on to other things now. In fact, the ones that are running now are drawing good business, like Hawaii. And here in this very issue, he still says this sets up the apparent Flair versus Hogan match. So where did that narrative change and why did it change? All right, so let's go to the February 3rd Observer and see if we can find anything about Ric Flair and WrestleMania. Okay, this is the lead story, mind you. Okay, the top two spots for WrestleMania seem to be finalized as Hulk Hogan versus Sid Justice and Ric Flair versus Randy Savage for the WWF title. The change from the originally planned Hogan-Flair title match changed sometime in early January, and one can speculate as to why. Bottom line is, if they were going to do Hogan-Flair, that would mean a title change. And one questioned the business sense of that title change, given that Hogan would be taking 5 months off to do a movie, and there are a lot of questions regarding Hogan's future in wrestling. Well, that's easy to overcome. Easy. Okay? I understand you want to end WrestleMania with a babyface going over, but you have Flair beat Hogan cheaply to retain the title. And then Hogan, maybe it's a loser leave town. Maybe it's I put my career on the line, and then in 6 months' time or whatever, Hogan somehow through hook or by crook returns, makes some sort of challenge. Ric Flair is goaded into giving him a title shot, and Hogan comes back, and you do it for, some other show down the road. I mean, it's just a minor booking situation to deal with. All right, still, the Observer says, the angle shot January 27th in Lubbock, Texas for the Fox Primetime Special on February 8th involved a tag team match with Hulk Hogan and Sid Justice versus Ric Flair and The Undertaker. Brutus Beefcake accompanied Hogan and Justice to the ring. Justice and Hogan argued throughout with Hogan completely playing to the crowd and Justice not to ensure the correct fan reaction, unlike Albany, where fans cheered Hogan. I'm sure he meant cheered Justice. Sid Justice walked out on Hogan, leaving him to be double-teamed by Ric Flair and The Undertaker until Brutus Beefcake ran in. But it was Hogan who made his own save and chased both Ric Flair and Undertaker from the ring. Later at the taping, Sid Justice, who's of course Sid Vicious, in case you didn't know, destroyed the barbershop set, which was hilarious because he accidentally busted a can of shaving cream, which sprayed him right directly in the face, and announced his new manager would be Harvey Wimpleman. Can you imagine Downtown Bruno as the manager for the lead heel in WWF? I'd never have believed that one. Well, I mean, it's because Harvey Wimpleman got Sid Vicious into the WWF. They were friends. They were good friends, dating back to their time where they were first put together as a deal down in Continental when Sid was humongous and Downtown Bruno went down there to manage him. But they were both sent from Memphis down there, so they knew each other from way back. He'll be doing the same stretcher gimmick he did with WCW. The fans booed Sid Justice when he brought out Whippleman. I believe the Ric Flair Savage angle will revolve around the photos of Elizabeth. They did try a dark match. They did a tryout dark match in Lubbock, ending with Flair getting DQ'd. This coming weekend in syndication, they'll announce the Mania April 5th in Indianapolis Hoosier Dome, main event as Ric Flair defending against Hulk Hogan. But the Fox angle, and I believe the subsequent angle, will wind up with Hogan pulling out of the match and the show switched to a double main event. We know that's ends up being what happened. So there's where the worm turned with Ric Flair, Hulk Hogan. So January of 92, that's where. And mind you, it wasn't, especially the Flair Savage match was great, right? But it wasn't the Flair Hogan match I think everybody had wanted, and everybody had, forever wanted to be this big dream matchup. You got to see it at some house shows, but if you were like me and they didn't come to your area, you didn't get to see it. Not till they showed up in WCW all those years later. And it's one of the biggest mishaps of all time, I think. Really, really a poor idea. All right, so we'll wrap up by going to the actual WrestleMania issue. Let's actually see what happened, what Dave said here about WrestleMania. So we're going to go to April 13th, 1992, Observer Newsletter. Good, bad, and ugly at WrestleMania 92, Ultimate Warrior's back, scandals, updates, and more. So here we go. Let's find our... And at this point in time, look, NWA Real World Champion, none of that matters after Ric Flair won the WWF title at the Royal Rumble. I mean, it's all about that. And that performance was incredible. And that Royal Rumble was one of the greatest of all time, probably the greatest Royal Rumble of all time, certainly one of the great all-time Ric Flair matches. And at that point in time, honestly, if that was the direction they went, sure. He's the WWF. There's no reason in invoking this Real World Championship because he is the champion of everything at that point, if you believe it. Okay, Randy Savage pinned Ric Flair to win the WWF Championship. This was expected to be the match of the show, and it lived up to it. The purported centerfold photo of Elizabeth that Titan was using as a lure to get last-minute buys never materialized. Randy Savage attacked Ric Flair early, with Mr. Perfect saving Flair from the early beating. Flair took all of his bumps for the first 2 minutes before backdropping Savage over the top rope, and Savage taking the bump like a Mexican wrestler. Those are Dave's words. Ric Flair kept the advantage for the next several minutes. The only negative about the work were that a lot of Savage clotheslines looked real bad, and Flair sold them like they weren't. Randy Savage come off the top rope to the floor with a double sledge, and Ric Flair juiced after hitting his head on the guardrail. Savage suplexed him on the floor. Savage hit the elbow off the top rope, but Mr. Perfect interfered right in front of the ref and pulled Savage off. Then came the ref bump. Mr. Perfect, Kurt Hennig, gave Ric Flair a foreign object, and he hit Savage, but Savage kicked out. And I'll bet 90% of the people watching thought that was going to be the real finish. Mr. Perfect then attacked Savage's knee, and Elizabeth came down to ringside with Shane McMahon, Dave Hebner, Rene Goulet, Jay Strongbow, and J.J. Dillon. Or that's who they told me it was. I've watched the tape 3 times, and I still don't believe it, since he looked like a taller Jim Barnett. Blocking the view of all those nice folks who paid $125 for ringside during the hottest part of the match on the show to act like they didn't want to be there. $125 for ringside seat. You can't buy garbage seats for that anymore at any concert, much less WrestleMania. Good Lord. Ric Flair got the figure 4 on. Savage reversed it. In the ensuing melee, Savage schoolboyed Flair using the tights and got the pin. Ric Flair kissed Elizabeth, who started slapping him after the match. Savage jumped on Flair, and Perfect jumped on Savage, and the gang in suits all jumped on everyone and got jumped on, and everyone was jumping on everyone. Doesn't this sound like a Now It Can Be Told all over again? Wow, that is some impressive wording there by Dave. All right. And believe it or not, in this issue, Ric Flair's name's only mentioned 19 times, and 13 of those was in that one thing I just read. Post-WrestleMania cards consist of one show being comprised largely of Savage Flair return title matches, with the top two underneath matches being Undertaker versus Papa Shango and a Money Inc. versus the Natural Disasters. Top 3 matches on other shows will be Ultimate Warrior versus Sid Justice, Bret Hart versus Shawn Michaels, and the Legion of Doom versus the Beverly Brothers. Some of the underneath early summer marriages to round out the shows will be Tatanka versus Colonel Mustafa, Virgil versus the Berserker, Kerry Von Erich versus Skinner, Chris Walker, oh my God, versus Bob Bradley, Sergeant Slaughter versus the Mountie in Battle of the Round Hat People, Repo Man versus British Bulldog, Tito Santana versus Rick Martel, Owen Hart versus Jim Powers, Big Boss Man versus the Convict, that was, of course, Big Nails, to kick in a few months down the line, not right away, and the Nasty Boys versus Kato and Crush. I don't remember what the story behind that tag team was. All right. Wow, what a ride. The saga of Ric Flair, the NWA World title, the WCW World title, the WWF World title. We've had plexiglass mazes and quicksand and Harvey Whippleman and you name it, we've had it. What a wild time in wrestling. Arsenio Hall shows, steroids. Incredible. Absolutely bizarre time behind the scenes in wrestling. Even though business in the ring and in the arenas wasn't the best ever, good Lord, what a time to be alive with all the behind-the-scenes stuff going on. I certainly hope you've enjoyed this. Andrew, thank you for submitting that. And we're going to continue doing these one-off specials along the way, so look for more to come. Again, there's a massive Kerry Von Erich show coming up in 2 weeks. You will not want to miss that one. It's basically an audio book of the life and times of the Von Erich family, so stick around for that. In the meantime, thank you very much. Spread the word about whenitwascool.com. Let everybody know, hey, man, you should have heard this show. Quicksand, by God, was talked about on this show, and help us gain some new Patreons. And, hey, that's it. Let's get out of here. Thank you very much for listening. I'll see you here again soon with another show.